Is time even real, or just a human illusion? It's a question that has lingered like a shadow across every civilization, nestled in ancient myths, ticking behind scientific theories, and stretching through the folds of personal memory. We wake by the clock, age with the calendar, and speak of past and future as though they were solid places we can point to. Yet the more we probe into what time actually is, the more it begins to dissolve beneath our scrutiny. Physicists map it with precision, philosophers unravel it with doubt, and psychologists confess how easily it deceives the mind. And still, we live by it. Or, at least we think we do. Time, as we typically imagine it, feels fixed, an arrow pointing in one unwavering direction. But is that direction intrinsic to the universe, or merely something we impose upon it? Is time flowing like a river, or are we the ones moving, caught in a perceptual current we mistake for motion? Why does a moment of pain feel longer than a moment of joy? Why do we relive memories as if they were still real, yet never quite escape the present? If time exists independently of us, then what explains its deeply personal character? If it doesn't, what is ticking inside an atomic clock? Beneath this question lies a strange tension between two kinds of time. The cold, objective intervals marked by seconds and space-time equations and the inner elastic landscape shaped by consciousness. What begins as a simple inquiry quickly spirals into a profound enigma, connecting ancient cosmologies to quantum puzzles, medieval theology to modern neuroscience. To explore whether time is real or just a human illusion, we must journey through the very structures of knowledge that gave us the concept in the first place. The oldest questions about time didn't begin in laboratories or lecture halls, but under open skies. Long before equations or pendulums, time was written in the heavens. The first humans to raise their eyes to the night did not see abstract physics, but a living cosmos-sized stage upon which gods, seasons, and destinies played out. Celestial rhythms, regular yet mysterious, offered the earliest scaffolding upon which humans built the notion of time, not as an objective metric, but as something sacred and cyclical. Stars rose and fell, the moon waxed and waned, and each recurrence became not a repetition, but a returner, reanimation of meaning. To track time was not simply to measure, was to align, to anticipate, and to participate in a cosmic dance. The Babylonians, among the earliest master observers of the sky, etched these rhythms onto clay tablets, giving rise to one of the first organized systems of timekeeping. Their mathematical innovations were astonishing. Base 60 notation, still preserved in our 60-minute hours and 60-second minutes, came from their hands. They recognized lunar cycles and months to keep their calendars in harmony with the seasons. Time for them was intimately tied to the divine, with each planet associated with a deity and each movement carrying omens for kings and kingdoms. Their ziggurats were more than religious monuments. They were observatories, colossal sentinels, watching over the choreography of the cosmos. Meanwhile, in Egypt, time was charted by a river. The annual flooding of the Nile was both a physical necessity and a spiritual event, the pulse by which the entire civilization lived and prospered. Egyptian priests used a calendar of 365 days, divided into 12 months of 30 days plus 5 days dedicated to the gods. Timekeeping was not separate from theology, it was an extension of it. The heliacal rising of Sirius, heralding the inundation of the Nile, was a sacred signal, observed carefully and ceremoniously, linking the terrestrial with the celestial. Temples, aligned with stellar events, were constructed to mark not merely time's passage but time's participation in the divine order. The Mayans, too, approached time with awe and intricacy, weaving an architecture of chronology that was both scientific and metaphysical. Their long count calendar could track epochs stretching across thousands of years, while their Tezocan and Hob cycles reflected a profound understanding of agricultural rhythms, planetary conjunctions, and mythic cycles. Time to the Maya was not linear but fractal, an endlessly recursive pattern echoing through every level of the cosmos. Events did not merely happen once, they echoed the vibrations of earlier cosmic moments. Their ceremonial centers, such as those at Copan and Tikal, were built in alignment with solar and planetary events, creating a built environment that embodied time itself. One did not simply move through space, but also through layers of temporal significance, each day infused with the weight of myth and omen. In ancient China, time bore the imprint of duality's yin and yang, heaven and earth, movement and stillness. Their calendrical system, developed over millennia, combined solar and lunar observations into a lunar-solar calendar that harmonized the rhythms of nature with human affairs. The Chinese zodiac, rooted in a 60-year cycle, reflected both temporal continuity and cosmic personality. Time was not inert, but animated, shaped by heavenly stems and earthly branches, influenced by the positions of the planets and the balance of elemental forces. The Emperor, as the Son of Heaven, was expected to maintain this cosmic harmony, and calendrical reform was often a political and spiritual act. The Bureau of Astronomy was a pillar of statecraft, its calculations critical, not just for agricultural success but for imperial legitimacy. Yet long before paper calendars or clay tablets, there were stones. In Britain, the builders of Stonehenge arranged massive slabs in a circle that aligned with solstices, creating one of the earliest known monuments to astronomical timekeeping. Though their language and rituals are lost to us, the precision with which the stones were placed speaks to an extraordinary awareness of solar movement and seasonal change. These megalithic timekeepers mark an important threshold, the transition from observing time in nature to fixing it in structure. By embedding celestial patterns in earthbound stones, early peoples sought not just to measure time, but to materialize it. Time became visible, spatial, and ritualized. Another relic of ancient genius, the Antikythera mechanism, discovered in a Roman-era shipwreck near Greece, shattered assumptions about ancient technological sophistication. Dating to the 2nd century BCE, this intricate gear-driven device could predict eclipses, track planetary motions, and follow the cycles of major athletic festivals. Often called the first analog computer, it revealed a level of astronomical and mechanical understanding far beyond what was thought possible for its time. That such a device existed suggests that the ancient Greeks, influenced by both Babylonian observations and their own geometrical insights, viewed time not as a static backdrop but as a complex system to be decoded and anticipated. These early civilizations did not merely watch the heavens passively. They drew time down from the sky, mapped it onto temples and pyramids, inscribed it into calendars, encoded it in devices, and enacted it in rituals. In doing so, they transformed time from a natural phenomenon into a social instrument. Calendars became tools for organizing labor, for planning harvests, for determining festival dates and coronations. Timekeeping became a form of power. Those who controlled the calendar, priests, astronomers, kings, controlled not only the rhythm of daily life, but the narrative of existence itself. In that sense, time emerged as both a cosmic gift and a human invention. Yet, within this shaping of time, there remained an undercurrent of mystery. Time's regularities, so its repeating cycles, did not banish its enigma. On the contrary, they deepened it. Why did the heavens move as they did? Why did seasons change with such dependable precision? These questions prompted not only technical innovation but mythic imagination. Time was born in stories, many of which described its beginning and end. The Babylonians spoke of a cosmic battle before the ordering of time. The Egyptians placed time in the hands of the sun god Ra, who sailed across the sky and the underworld. The Maya saw time as both the product of divine creation and the field in which cosmic drama unfolded endlessly. These were not contradictions, but complements, ways to hold the enigma of time from both the outside and the inside. What emerges from this ancient tapestry is a dual picture. On the one hand, time as something external, measured by celestial motion. On the other, time as something lived, infused with significance, embedded in culture and ritual. That duality persists even now, though we rarely recognize its roots. We may consult atomic clocks rather than lunar calendars, but we still hold birthday parties, celebrate New Year's, and mourn anniversaries, rituals that echo the ancient need to locate ourselves not only in space but in time. The tools have changed, but the impulse has not. Even the act of measuring time arose not solely from intellectual curiosity, but from urgent need. Agriculture depended on it. Societies required coordination: when to plant, when to harvest, when to sacrifice, when to build. The rhythms of the sky became the rhythms of human life, and in some sense, those rhythms had to be forced into consistency. The natural world offers cues, but not certainties. So timekeeping became a means of imposing reliability on an unreliable world. Calendars smoothed out irregularities. Rituals provided anchors. Time was no longer simply observed. It was crafted, domesticated, woven into law, kingship, and architecture. As cities grew and empires expanded, time became increasingly standardized. Calendrical reform was not merely a scientific effort, it was deeply political. Julius Caesar's introduction of the Julian calendar, guided by Egyptian astronomers, was an effort to realign civic life with the heavens and assert Roman control over chronology itself. The Mayan priesthood guarded their calendar knowledge jealously, for it determined when wars were fought and when kings were crowned. In China, a change in dynastic rule was often accompanied by a recalibration of time, symbolizing a new harmony between heaven and earth. To master time was to master order itself. And yet, amid all this precision, time remained fundamentally mysterious. The tools built to track it only deepened the question of what it actually was. Why should celestial cycles matter to human affairs? Why do we instinctively mark the passing of years, the recurrence of seasons, the moment of a birth or death? The ancients didn't separate these practical and metaphysical aspects. Time was at once a schedule and a symbol, a measurement and a myth. It governed crops and cosmologies, taxes and temples, festivals and funerals. These ancient foundations continue to shape the frameworks we still use. The 7-day week, with roots in Babylonian planetary worship, the division of the day into 24 hours, tracing back to Egyptian sundials and Babylonian math. Even the persistence of astrological language and modern cultural reveal how deeply embedded these early conceptions of time remain. When we speak of Mercury in retrograde or celebrate a solar eclipse, we echo voices thousands of years old, still whispering through the gears of our digital clocks, though modern science will challenge, revise, and sometimes overturn these ancient models. Their influence cannot be erased. They provided the first maps of time, the first attempt to domesticate the infinite, and, in doing so, they set the stage for the paradoxes and revelations that would come later. The early civilizations had constructed time as something sacred and cyclical, embedded in nature and mirrored in ritual. But as the Greek world began to rise, its thinkers, stepping back from myth and moving toward abstraction, the question of time took on a sharper, more philosophical edge. Rather than simply charting its movements, Greek philosophers asked what time was. They turned inward and conceptual, peeling back the outer layers of measurement to probe its essence. This shift from time as something observed to time as something analyzed marked a critical turning point in humanity's relationship with the temporal dot. Among the earliest efforts to wrestle with time philosophically came from the enigmatic figure of Parmenides. In his radical assertion that change was an illusion, Parmenides rejected the very notion of time's passage. For him, all that truly existed was a timeless, unchanging unity. Movement, becoming, even birth and death were mere illusions of perception. This denial of time as a real feature of the world would echo through philosophical traditions for centuries. But if Parmenides tried to erase time, his successors attempted to explain it. Heraclitus, often seen as Parmenides' great opponent, embraced flux as the fundamental reality. His famous claim that one cannot step into the same river twice spoke not only of change, but of a world defined by perpetual transformation. For Heraclitus, time was not merely relit, was the very heartbeat of existence. Everything flowed, nothing stayed. What existed was not a static being, but a becoming, a fire always consuming and renewing itself. And yet, in the tension between Heraclitus and Parmenides, between eternal change and eternal stasis, the Greeks began to discover that time was not a simple matter. It was Plato who gave these philosophical instincts their first rigorous structure. In his dialogue, Timaeus Plato offered one of the earliest full cosmological theories in Western thought. There, he famously claimed that time was created along with the heavens. Time came into being with the universe. The cosmos, for Plato, was a living, rational soul, the product of a divine artisan, the demiurge, who crafted it using eternal forms as templates. In creating the cosmos, the demiurge also created time as an image of eternity, measured by the regular motions of the celestial bodies. Time, then, was not eternal itself. It was a moving image of the eternal. This delicate distinction allowed Plato to hold both temporal flow and timeless truth together in a single vision. Plato's theory of time was deeply mathematical. The heavens moved in regular cycles, and these movements gave rise to the perception of time. But the true realm, the forms, existed outside of time, in an eternal, changeless realm of perfect intelligibility. Thus, time became a kind of veil, obscuring our view of the real with shadows and appearances. In this sense, time was both necessary and misleading. It provided the framework for our worldly experiences, but it also distracted us from the timeless truths accessible only to reason. Aristotle, Plato's student, took a different approach. In his physics, he defined time as the number of motion with respect to before and after. Time, for Aristotle, was not an entity in itself, but a feature of motion. It was a way of counting change. Without change, there would be no time. Time was not a thing, nor a container in which things happened. It was an abstraction dependent upon the ordering of events. This made time relational. It required a mind to perceive the before and after, to register succession and duration. Time was inseparable from both motion and perception. Aristotle's insistence that time was neither substance nor independent reality would later influence medieval and early modern thinkers profoundly. He allowed for time to be measured by the movement of celestial bodies, but rejected the idea that time existed outside of motion. His view offered a more grounded, empirical framework than Plato's metaphysical idealism. Still, the question remained: if time is just the measure of motion, then what happens to time if nothing moves? And if no one is there to perceive motion, is time still passing? This line of questioning would be taken up centuries later, but it was already implicit in some of the paradoxes posed by the pre-Socratic thinker Zeno of Ilia. His most famous paradox, that of Achilles and the tortoise, presents a scenario in which swift Achilles can never overtake a slow-moving tortoise if the tortoise has a head start. Zeno argued that before Achilles can reach the tortoise, he must first reach the point where the tortoise began. But by the time he gets there, the tortoise has moved forward slightly, and so on ad infinitum. The race, therefore, contains an infinite number of steps. How can motion occur, Zeno asked, if an infinite number of points must be crossed? Though these paradoxes seemed absurd on the surface, they forced a deeper consideration of motion, continuity, and division, questions that strike at the heart of what time even means. If time is composed of indivisible instants, how can anything ever move between them? If it's infinitely divisible, how can we traverse an infinite number of moments in a finite duration? Zeno's thought experiments challenged the coherence of our most basic assumptions and laid the groundwork for later developments in calculus and physics. Though their full implications would not be appreciated for centuries, the Greeks did not only grapple with time as quantity, they also distinguished between different kinds of time. Most famously, they separated chronos, sequential, clock-like time, from kairos, which referred to the opportune or fitting moment. Chronos is the time we count: hours, days, years. Kairos is the time we feel those instances when something must happen or something is ripe to occur. A speech delivered at the wrong moment is ineffective, no matter how eloquent. A harvest taken too early or too late is lost. Kairos refers to timing in the richer, qualitative sense, the fullness or emptiness of a moment. This distinction reveals how deeply the Greeks understood time as not merely a sequence, but a field of significance. In the realm of politics, rhetoric, art, and even warfare, kairos was essential. One had to act at the right time, not just in time. This kind of temporality was closer to experience than to calculation, and it anticipated later philosophical explorations of lived time. It suggested that time is not a neutral backdrop, but a texture sometimes dense, sometimes thin, and always charged with potential. Later Greek thinkers like Plotinus would return to time with mystical fervor. In his Neoplatonic vision, time and soul were intimately bound. Plotinus believed that the soul, in its descent from the Eternal One, introduced time into the world through its motions. Time, then, was not external to consciousness, but born from it. Time, he wrote, is the life of the soul in a movement passing from one stage to another. For Plotinus, as for Plato, eternity was the true reality. Time was its echo, stretched into the finite world. To ascend back to the divine was to transcend time altogether. Plotinus's view marked an important shift in the philosophy of time, one that emphasized interiority, Time was no longer a feature of the cosmos alone. It was also a condition of the soul's experience. This view would influence early Christian theology and medieval mysticism, planting the seeds for later conceptions of psychological time. The contrast between the eternal and the temporal, so central to Greek thought, would echo through Augustine's reflections and even through the modern tension between physics and consciousness. But even as the Greeks developed these layered, intricate ideas of time, they struggled to reconcile their own categories. If time was dependent on motion, as Aristotle claimed, how did one explain the continuity of identity across time? If time was the image of eternity, as Plato held, how could the material world, so full of imperfection, be governed by something derived from perfection? These were not merely abstract dilemmas. They reached into ethics, politics, aesthetics, and the very purpose of philosophy. For the Greeks, to understand time was to understand the human condition itself, its limits, its rhythms, its search for order amid change. Their language preserved this dual approach. Chronos was the ticking sequence of instants, the ruler of age and decay. Kairos was the god of the critical moment, whose fleeting presence demanded seizing. The Greeks saw that time could be both crushing and liberating, both mechanical and meaningful. This ambivalence continues to haunt us today. In our constant oscillation between the calendar and the inner clock, the deadlines we dread and the moments we treasured. Greek thought gave Western civilization its earliest intellectual frameworks for interpreting time, not merely as something that passes, but as something that frames meaning. It introduced the tools, the paradoxes, the distinctions, chronos and kairos, motion and number, eternity and change, that would inform not only metaphysics, but theology, science, and art for centuries to come. As Greek thought began to weave itself into the religious and intellectual currents of the ancient Mediterranean world, its abstract concepts of time, both flowing and eternal, measurable and mystical, met with new theological narratives that would transform the very architecture of temporality. With the rise of the Abrahamic faiths, time underwent a profound reorientation. No longer simply cyclical, nor merely philosophical, it was cast into a linear story, one with a definite origin, a purposeful unfolding, and a climactic end. This was not time as recurrence, nor as static eternity reflected in motion, but time as a sacred journey from creation to judgment. The heavens still moved, but now their rhythms were subordinated to a deeper moral and eschatological direction. The cosmos had a beginning in divine will and an end in divine reckoning. This transformation is especially evident in the Christian tradition, which inherited Jewish sacred history while reinterpreting it through the life, death, and resurrection of Christ. Time was now seen as the medium in which salvation history unfolded. The Genesis narrative placed creation at a definitive starting point. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. From this point forward, history became a divine script, marked by covenants, prophecies, and fulfillments. Events did not merely happen. They meant something, and their meaning was anchored in their position within a divine timeline. History was not random, it was directed. Within this framework, Christ's incarnation represented a hinge in time, a moment when the eternal entered the temporal, when the divine word took on flesh. For the early church, this was not merely a historical event but a metaphysical turning point. It redefined time itself. The Apostle Paul spoke of the fullness of time, pleroma istoshrano, when Christ came into the world, suggesting that moments could carry not just sequence, but density echoing the Greek concept of kairos, while embedding it within divine purpose. Every second thereafter pointed toward a consummation, the return of Christ and the final judgment. But while the structure of this vision was linear, it was not devoid of depth. The Church Fathers, especially Augustine of Hippo, would wrestle with the nature of time as something both objective and interior. In his Confessions, Augustine famously asked, "What then is time? If no one asks me, I know. If I wish to explain it to one who asks, I do not know." This statement does not merely reflect confusion, it reveals the profundity of the problem. For Augustine, time was not a thing in the world, nor a function of celestial motion, as Aristotle had claimed. It was instead something experienced by the soul. The past existed in memory, the future in expectation, and only the present in attention. This tripartite structure, memoria, expectatio, and attentio, allowed Augustine to relocate time from the stars to the self. It was not the cosmos that granted time its reality, but consciousness. The soul stretched itself between recollection and anticipation, measuring time not with numbers, but with awareness. Thus, even within a theological framework that insisted on a historical timeline, creation, fall, redemption, apocalypse, there emerged a deeply subjective dimension of time. Human beings were not merely actors within time. They were also its perceivers, its narrators, even its shapers. Augustine's influence would echo throughout the medieval world, bridging theological doctrine with psychological insight. Time was linear in its grand arc, but deeply personal in its unfolding. Salvation might be an event in history, but it was also a drama within the soul. The moment of conversion so pivotal in Augustine's own life was a collision between chronological sequence and eternal truth, a flash in which time and timelessness met. This encounter lent Christian time a dual tension. It moved inexorably toward an end, yet at every moment eternity might break in. Each second could contain the divine. This outlook imbued the medieval Christian world with a heightened sense of temporality. The calendar was no longer merely a tool for agriculture or ritual, it became a sacred instrument. Liturgical seasons, feast days, fasts, and festivals ordered time according to the rhythms of Christ's life and the unfolding of salvation. The year was not just a circle of days, it was a spiritual map. Advent, Christmas, Lent, Easter, Pentecost offered not only a memory of past events, but an invitation to reenact and relive them. In this way, time became layered, simultaneously historical, liturgical, and mystical. The apocalyptic imagination also played a crucial role in Christian conceptions of time. The Book of Revelation did not merely predict the end of history, it transformed how believers lived within time. Each generation believed it might be the last. Signs and portents were read not as random events, but as signals, foreshadowings of the final unveiling. Time was under pressure, charged with urgency. To live in time was to live in expectation. This eschatological horizon lent Christian life both structure and anxiety. Salvation was near, but so was judgment. Islamic thought, emerging in the 7th century CE, inherited this linear structure but developed its own unique temporal sensibility. Like Judaism and Christianity, Islam posited a clear beginning, creation by a single, omnipotent God, and a definitive end, the Day of Judgment. The Quran presents history as a series of prophetic missions, each calling a community back to the path of righteousness, culminating in the final revelation to Muhammad. This sequence reinforced a linear conception of time. humanity moves through epochs, guided by divine messages, toward an ultimate reckoning. Yet Islamic time was also richly textured. The concept of qadar, divine decree, introduced a complex interplay between human action and divine predestination. Time belonged to God, and within it, everything unfolded according to His will. But this did not render human effort meaningless. Rather, it placed human action within a larger framework of moral accountability. The world was a test, and time the field of that testing. Every moment held spiritual weight. As the Quran repeatedly reminds, by time, indeed, man is in laws, except those who believe and do righteous deeds. This intense moral charge of time gave rise to a deep emphasis on mindfulness and punctuality, visible in Islamic ritual. Practices, the 5 daily prayers, fixed to specific times of day, structured the believer's passage through each cycle of sunlight and shadow. Time was thus sanctified not only through narrative but through rhythm. The lunar calendar, used for religious observances such as Ramadan and Hajj, reinforced the sense that divine rhythms were embedded in celestial motion. Yet unlike the Gregorian calendar, which fixes itself to the solar year, the Islamic year drifts, resisting seasonal anchoring. This fluidity suggested that sacred time need not align with earthly seasons, belonged to a higher order. Islamic scholars and philosophers also engaged deeply with Greek thought, preserving and expanding upon it during the European Middle Ages. Thinkers such as Al-Farabi, Avicenna, Ibn Sina, and Averroes ibn Rushd integrated Aristotelian definitions of time with Islamic metaphysics. Avicenna, for example, distinguished between time as a measure of motion and time as something perceived by the soul. Echoing Augustine even as he built on Aristotle, he understood that time was not only a sequence, but a condition of understanding, causality, and change. Without time, there would be no knowledge of process, no growth, no history, only frozen being. Mystical Islamic traditions, particularly within Sufism, introduced even more nuanced conceptions of time. The Sufi path was a journey not just through moral stages, but through spiritual moments. Time could dilate, pause, or collapse in the presence of divine ecstasy. The concept of waq, tether, spiritual moment, mirrored Kairos in its insistence that some instants were more charged than others. Saints and mystics spoke of timeless states, of annihilation of the ego fana, and union with the divine Baka, in which time lost its grip. These were not metaphors, but lived experiences, suggesting that while time governed the body, the soul could transcend it. Across both Christian and Islamic traditions, then, time was not merely a neutral flow. It was directed, moralized, and sacred. It moved forward toward an end, but at any moment, it could open inward. The clock ticked toward judgment, but within. Each tick was the possibility of grace, repentance, illumination. In this sense, the Abrahamic understanding of time was profoundly paradoxical. It was linear, yet capable of rupture, historical, yet open to eternity. And always, it was watched not only by the divine, but by the soul trying to make sense of its own unfolding. The transition from ancient cyclical time to this linear, moralized temporality marked a deep shift in human consciousness. Time was no longer just a measure of change or a reflection of the stars. It became a story, with a plot and a purpose. To exist in time was to be part of that story, either aligned with its divine direction or lost in deviation. The past was sacred. Memory, the present a moment of decision, and the future a field of divine promise or judgment. This reimagining of time would shape not only religious thought, but the development of history, literature, ethics, and law. The seeds planted by the Greeks had not been abandoned. They had been grafted onto new theological roots. The eternal forms became the mind of God. The unmoved mover became the creator and judge. The subjective time of the soul, hinted at by Plotinus, became the battleground of salvation. Chronos and Kairos, no longer mere concepts, became conditions of faith. To understand time was no longer a philosophical exercise, was a spiritual imperative, long before the hum of factories or the tick of pocket watches. Time was a matter of sunlight, seasons, and sacred repetition. But with the slow rise of mechanical time in medieval Europe, that fluid, cosmic rhythm gave way to the steady march of gears, weights, and bells, devices that imposed order, precision, and regulation where once there was natural flow. This shift didn't happen all at once, nor was it universal. It began quietly, tucked inside monastic walls, where a different kind of rhythm was already forming, one shaped by prayer, devotion, and the pursuit of heavenly order. Monasteries, particularly those governed by the rule of Saint Benedict, were among the earliest institutions to demand strict temporal structure. Benedictines were not merely spiritual communities but engines of discipline. Their days were divided not according to the sun's casual rise or the moon's soft drift, but by the call to divine office matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline. Each demanded attention at precise intervals. At first, monks relied on the ringing of bells, sundials, and later, water clocks to signal these moments. But as their routines grew more rigorous and their scriptoria more industrious, accuracy became paramount. This craving for temporal precision gave birth to one of the most revolutionary mechanisms in human history, the mechanical clock. The earliest mechanical clocks emerged in the 13th century, driven not by pendulums or springs, but by falling weights. And the escapement mechanism, crucial innovation that regulated energy flow and allowed for controlled ticking. The Cathedral of Salisbury boasted one of the oldest examples. Built around 1386, these clocks didn't tell time as we know it today, with hands and dials. Instead, they rang bells at fixed intervals, marking canonical hours rather than tracking minutes. But even this rough measure was enough to alter the relationship between people and the passage of time. Initially, these clocks served religious ends. Bells told monks when to pray, when to eat, when to sleep. But as these towers rose above cities and towns, their chimes also reached common ears: merchants, farmers, guildsmen who began to structure their daily lives in accordance with these audible boundaries. Time, once a silent partner of experience, began to speak aloud. With bells tolling from high steeples and civic towers, communities began to standardize behavior. The town of Milan installed one such public clock in the 14th century, and soon many others followed. Mechanical clocks weren't merely instruments, they were assertions of authority. To control the clock was to control the rhythm of life. Civic leaders and religious heads both vied for that control, knowing the psychological power of synchronizing a population. The result was a subtle but profound transformation. People no longer lived with time. They began to live in time. This transition also had economic consequences. Markets began to open and close on time. Contracts were enforced by specific hours, and a shared understanding of punctuality emerged. In port cities like Venice and Bruges, where trade was king, this temporal regularity became especially important. Tardiness could mean missed ships or spoiled goods. A merchant class increasingly dependent on coordination and accountability required a measure of time that was not just natural but mechanical, precise, and binding. The Industrial Revolution would later elevate this relationship to an entirely new level, but its seeds were already being planted during this earlier era. The notion of labor began to shift, from a task completed in accordance with nature's rhythm to one performed according to the ticking of a clock. In the fields, workers had followed the sun. In the shops and workshops of growing towns, they began to follow bells. And in that shift lay a growing tension between human perception and mechanical expectation. By the 15th and 16th centuries, clocks began appearing in homes of the wealthy. Innovations like the spring-driven mechanism allowed for portability, and artisans in Nuremberg and Milan created ornate timepieces that were both functional and symbolic. Owning a clock was a display of orderliness, discipline, and status. These were not yet instruments for scheduling every moment, but reminders of mortality memento. Maury devices with skulls and hourglasses etched onto their surfaces. Time was not only to be measured but also feared. The spread of mechanical timekeeping altered how people thought about work, rest, and even morality. The Protestant Reformation added fuel to this fire, particularly through Calvinist teachings that emphasized industriousness, punctuality, and the moral dangers of idleness. In this context, time was not merely a tool, it was a test. To waste time was to waste a divine gift, and clocks became moral overseers, whispering constant reminders of responsibility. What began as sacred rhythms in monasteries thus evolved into secular pressures in towns and cities. With the advent of the pendulum clock in the 17th century, pioneered by Christian Huygens, timekeeping reached an entirely new level of precision. The pendulum's swing was reliable and consistent, allowing clocks to lose mere seconds, a day unthinkable in earlier designs. This new precision found a home in scientific circles, where the measurement of time was essential to understanding motion, astronomy, and natural laws. Galileo had already observed the isochronous nature of pendulums in cathedral lamps, and Newton would later depend on exact time to formulate the laws of motion and gravity. Yet even as science demanded stricter measures, daily life continued to be reshaped by these advances. Factories, unlike workshops or farms, required synchronized labor. Workers had to arrive and depart on time. Breaks were regimented. Output was measured in hours. This was not merely a cultural shift, it was a psychological one. Time became both an abstract force and a tyrant. In the dark, soot-stained factories of Manchester or the steam-driven mills of the Ruhr Valley, the clock ruled over flesh and will alike. And with it came new social divisions. The factory owner could afford the timepiece, the worker could not. Thus, punctuality became both a virtue and a privilege. Lateness was penalized, efficiency was rewarded. The segmentation of time into hours, minutes, and seconds began to shape the modern workweek, school system, and public life. Clocks hung in railway stations, banks, schools, and eventually in every home. Public time became private time. This mechanical domination of time also affected the psyche. Where once life unfolded in the gentle arc of seasons or the shared rituals of community, it now marched along an invisible grid. Writers like Charles Dickens and philosophers like Karl Marx captured the alienation of this experience. Marx saw time discipline as a tool of capitalist control, a means of extracting the maximum labor with minimum cost. Time no longer belonged to the self, it belonged to production. In rural areas, the impact was slower but inevitable. As railroads stretched across continents, time zones were created. Trains needed schedules, and those schedules demanded uniformity. Before this, towns each kept their own local time, often marked by a church bell or sundial. But that no longer sufficed in the age of steam. In 1884, the International Meridian Conference established Greenwich as the prime meridian and divided the world into 24 standard time zones. The sun still rose and set, but the clock dictated when work began, when meals were taken, and when one should rest. This standardization, while practical, further severed the link between natural cycles and human rhythm. It also laid the foundation for modern anxieties, feeling rushed, running late, or being out of time. These were not concerns of the ancient farmer or the medieval monk. They were born in the tick of the gear, the clang of the bell, the urgency of the whistle. Still, there were pockets of resistance. Romantic poets like Wordsworth mourned the loss of natural harmony. Rural communities clung to seasonal festivals and cyclical celebrations. But the arc of history favored the mechanical. Even leisure began to be scheduled. Holidays were planned by the calendar, not the harvest. The body's rhythms yielded to the schedule. Sleep became segmented to fit work hours. Meals aligned with the lunch bell rather than hunger. A life that once danced to the moon and stars now marched to the metronome of commerce. And yet, beneath this rigid structure, older rhythms remained submerged, but not extinguished. The heart still beat without reference to clocks. The mind wandered outside schedules, dreaming paid no heed to ours. There was always a tension between the lived experience of time and its mechanical measure. People began to notice how some moments felt stretched, others compressed. A minute waiting in fear felt longer than an hour in joy. The clock kept ticking, but the mind danced to a different rhythm. This fracture between external and internal time would become more pronounced in the centuries ahead, especially as new technologies emerged to further atomize our attention and fragment our day. But the origins of that fracture lie herein: the bells of the monastery, the rise of the town clock, and the gears that turned silently in the watchmaker's workshop. The mechanical clock had not only changed the rhythm of towns and abbeys, it had instilled within the human psyche the sense that time was something that ticked forward independently of human concerns. As Europe moved into the Enlightenment, this growing trust in mechanical regularity fused with a rising intellectual current that sought to describe the universe in universal laws. The heartbeat of cosmic motion no longer needed divine orchestration, needed geometry, calculus, and a unified framework. Into this world stepped Isaac Newton, a man whose influence would transform not just physics, but the very idea of time itself. Newton's Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, published in 1687, was more than a scientific treatise. It was a blueprint for a mechanical cosmos, one governed by predictable mathematical laws rather than divine whimsy or metaphysical speculation. Central to Newton's formulation was a concept of time that stood apart from perception, matter, or motioner, kind of godlike metronome ticking steadily across all of space and through all events, regardless of whether anything was happening within them. He defined this as absolute, true, and mathematical time, and crucially, he insisted that it flows equably without relation to anything external. This assertion was not made in passing, it was foundational. Newton needed such a concept to make his system of physics cohere. If forces operated across distance and acceleration was measurable through time, then time itself needed to be stable and changing, eternal and independent. Otherwise, the laws would falter. Time in this schema became a kind of invisible scaffolding, a background grid upon which the universe played out its mechanics. And just like space, which Newton also considered absolute and unchanging, time provided a universal framework that made motion and causality calculable. To grasp why this mattered so deeply, consider how earlier thinkers had treated the problem. The scholastics had still nested their understanding of motion within Aristotelian metaphysics, in which time was contingent on change and observation, a measure of motion rather than a container for it. But Newton overturned that dependency. In his vision, time was no longer a mere derivative of motion or human sensing. Rather, it was its own entity, flowing regardless of whether anything moved or anyone was present to witness it. This was a radically de-anthropocentric vision. Human perception, emotions, and even the clock tower rhythms of the prior age were demoted in importance. Time now existed in the same objective register as mass or velocity. The philosophical implications of this were immense. If time existed apart from events, then it could be treated mathematically, charted in equations, measured with instruments, and relied upon for predictive accuracy. This gave Enlightenment science a powerful engine. With Newton's laws, engineers could build machines that operated according to precise predictions. Astronomers could chart celestial events centuries in advance. The very idea of a clockwork universe, popular in both scientific and religious writing of the period, rested on this idea that time, like the gears of a watch, advanced with regularity and without deviation. Yet not everyone agreed. Almost immediately, Newton's conception of absolute time encountered resistance, most notably from Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, the German polymath and co-inventor of calculus. Where Newton imagined time as a container, Leibniz viewed it as relational. For him, time had no independent existence. It emerged only from the relations among events. Without events, there was no time. In this view, time was not a flowing stream but a mental ordering of phenomena, a convenient way to describe change and succession. Leibniz pressed his objections in a now famous correspondence with the theologian Samuel Clarke, who defended Newtonian ideas. The debate grew not only metaphysical but theological. Leibniz worried that Newton's absolute space and time created a world in which God had to intervene to keep things ticking, something that Leibniz considered a blemish on divine perfection. Clarke responded that a perfect God would indeed institute such absolute structures, precisely because they ensured order and intelligibility. Beneath this theological skirmish lay a deep philosophical divergence. Was time something out there, like a grid extending to infinity, or was it a cognitive abstraction stitched together by human minds as they encountered change? Despite such disputes, Newton's conception gained ground. Part of this was due to the immense success of his physics. When the motions of the planets, the mechanics of falling bodies, and the flow of rivers could all be explained by a unified set of equations, few questioned the assumptions that underpinned them. The very fact that Newtonian time worked, that it allowed science and engineering to flourish, seemed to validate its truth. In this way, time became increasingly mathematized, abstract, and universal. From naval navigation to pendulum experiments, from shipyards to star charts, time marched ever forward as a neutral, reliable, and independent entity. The cultural effects of this shift were subtle but pervasive. Time became externalized, something that could be consulted, measured, and obeyed. just as the mechanical clock had dictated the rhythms of monasteries and merchant cities. Now Newtonian time shaped the imaginations of scientists, philosophers, and even artists. Timepieces became symbols not only of punctuality, but of rationality, mastery, and modernity. The precision of Newtonian equations reinforced a belief in objective truth, in a cosmos that could be mastered through intellect and discipline. But if Newton's absolute time elevated scientific progress, it also introduced new tensions. One such tension was philosophical. Could something that we never observe, directly time itself, truly be real in the same sense as matter or force? Newton admitted that we only experience relative, apparent, and common time, the kind marked by clocks and the passage of days. Absolute time, by contrast, was inaccessible to the senses. It was a metaphysical postulate, something assumed to exist for the sake of explanatory power. This division between time as it is and time as we perceive it opened a fissure that later thinkers would explore with increasing discomfort. Furthermore, Newtonian time posed practical limits. In Newton's framework, all motion was embedded within this universal time grid. Yet observers in motion relative to one another experienced different velocities and forces. Though Newtonian physics allowed for transformations between reference frames, it still assumed that time remained the same for all observers. This worked well enough at ordinary speeds, but as measurements became more precise, particularly in the 19th century with advancements in electromagnetism and optics, cracks in the edifice began to appear. By the late Enlightenment, however, these cracks remained largely invisible. Newton's view held sway in universities and observatories, in textbooks and treatises. It influenced not only physics, but the very structure of how societies organize themselves. Schedules, timetables, and international time standards all emerged within the Newtonian assumption that time could be synchronized across distances. The British Royal Navy's need for accurate longitude measurements drove the development of marine chronometers, which functioned precisely because they assumed a universal time standard that remained reliable across oceans. In this way, Newton's metaphysics found their way into the machinery of empire. In philosophical circles, though the debate never truly settled, Immanuel Kant, for instance, tried to bridge the divide by arguing that time and space were not external realities, but a priori forms of human intuition, necessary conditions for experience, rather than independent substances. In framework, time did not exist out there, as Newton claimed, nor was it merely relational, as Leibniz supposed. Instead, it was part of the cognitive structure through which we organized our perceptions. This move preserved the utility of Newtonian mechanics, while acknowledging that time might be more about human cognition than cosmic mechanics. This Kantian pivot, though influential, did not dethrone Newton in the realm of physics. For engineers, astronomers, and industrial planners, the clockwork model remained indispensable. Whether building railways or calculating eclipses, the assumption of a single, universal time offered immense practical power. Time zones, international datelines, and eventually coordinated universal time (UTC) all grew from this root. But beneath this practical efficiency, philosophical unease lingered, whispering doubts about whether the time of equations and the time of consciousness were truly the same. It would take a new kind of observation and a new kind of theory to challenge Newton's absolute framework, not just conceptually but empirically. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, such a challenge would come not from metaphysical speculation, but from the experimental evidence of motion, light, and speed. The very constancy of the speed of light, puzzling to Newtonian assumptions, would become the wedge that shattered absolute time and replaced it with something far stranger and more intimate: the elegant certainty of Newtonian time as uniform, universal, independent stood at the center of Enlightenment science until the early 20th century, when a deeper scrutiny of light, motion, and gravity revealed cracks too large to ignore. What seemed reliable became fragile under the weight of new experimental evidence. Albert Einstein's relativity would dismantle the Newtonian edifice, not through philosophical argument alone, but by showing empirically and conceptually that space and time were interwoven, that time itself could stretch, bend, and differ, depending on one's motion or position in a gravitational field. Einstein's journey began with special relativity in 1905, grounded in two simple postulates: the laws of physics are the same in all inertial frames, and the speed of light in vacuum is constant for all observers, regardless of their motion relative to the source. These seemingly modest claims carried enormous implications. If every observer measures light as having the same speed, then time and space cannot remain absolute. Simultaneity becomes relative to events that appear simultaneous to one observer, can occur at different times for another moving relative to them. Time dilation emerges. A moving clock ticks more slowly than a stationary one, as seen by an external observer. Length contraction follows. Lengths measured parallel to the motion shrink. Space and time no longer provide an immutable stage, but fuse into a new entity known as space-time. This new architecture fundamentally redefined time. No longer a universal backdrop, time became one coordinate among four in Minkowski spacetime, where intervals depend on relative motion. This meant that two observers in relative motion experience different elapsed times between the same events. Twins parting velocities and later reuniting age differently. These thought experiments, and later actual experiments, in particle physics and atomic clock flights confirmed time's malleability. Time was not absolute. It was relative to the observer's frame, influenced by velocity and gravity. General relativity, published in 1915, extended this restructuring. Einstein proposed that mass and energy bend space-time, and that gravity is not a force, but curvature guiding motion. In this theory, time itself is influenced by gravity. Clocks closer to a massive body tick more slowly relative to those further away. Light passing near a massive object is bent, and time slows near a black hole. Gravity wells distort temporal flow. The 1919 solar eclipse expedition, led by Sir Arthur Eddington, provided early empirical verification. Starlight bent around the sun by the predicted amount, lending strong support to general relativity and its implications for spacetime and time itself. That moment shifted the cultural understanding of time from an invisible constant to a dynamic, flexible dimension of the physical world. This conceptual upheaval rippled through physics and philosophy. Time dilation was no longer a theoretical curiosity. It became essential in global positioning systems, particle accelerators, and chronometric synchronization. GPS satellites must account for both special and general relativity to provide accurate location data. Time differences of microseconds between ground and orbit affect positions by meters if uncorrected. Practical infrastructure now depends on Einsteinian time. Philosophically, relativity revived debates that Newton's framework had tried to settle. The relational view of Leibniz, once overshadowed, resurfaced with vigor. If time emerges from physical relationships rather than existing independently, then its reality is contingent. And Kant's notion of time as a form of intuition also seemed inadequate. Space-time curvature exhibited objective effects, independent of human minds. Einstein himself flirted with philosophical reflections, but remained grounded in empiricism. His theories were judged by observation rather than metaphysical coherence. Einstein's revolution also challenged notions of temporal direction and absolute simultaneity. Without universal synchrony, there is no single now slicing across the cosmos. Instead, each observer carves their own now, depending on motion. Past and future shift depending on velocity and gravity. The block universe perspective emerges. In relativity, many scientists and philosophers conceive of space-time as a four-dimensional manifold where past, present, and future exist together, though experienced differently by observers. Time becomes another dimension, as real as length, but lacking intrinsic flow. Passage is an illusion or emergent phenomenon shaped by consciousness. These shifts inaugurated new metaphysical puzzles. If time is part of space-time, eternal and four-dimensional, why do we experience a flowing present? How do memory, anticipation, and attention fit within a static block? Physicists like Hermann Minkowski and later philosophers like Hugh Price and Julian Barber grappled with whether time is fundamental or emergent, whether the flow of time is real or anthropomorphic. Some argued that the passage of time is not part of the fundamental physics, but a psychological phenomenon emerging from entropy, information, or consciousness. Entropic considerations rooted in the second law of thermodynamics offered a thermodynamic arrow of time, while relativity remained time-symmetric. Statistical mechanics introduced direction. Systems evolved toward greater disorder, making the past distinguishable from the future. Einstein's relativity defines the geometry. Entropy defines direction. Time dilation, gravitational time shifts, and cosmic expansion all fit within a universe whose arrow points from low entropy in the past toward high entropy in the future. This interplay between physical symmetry and thermodynamic asymmetry continues to shape modern debates. Meanwhile, Einstein's revolution spurred further experimental confirmation. In the 1930s and 1940s, atomic clocks on airplanes confirmed time dilation. Minute discrepancies in particle lifetimes provided further verification. The Pound-Rebka experiment measured gravitational redshift and time dilation on Earth. Each confirmed that time could stretch, bend, and flow differently depending on motion and gravity. These aren't abstractions, they are components of everyday technology and high-energy physics. Despite its empirical success, relativity also unsettled cultural and philosophical assumptions. The ideal of universal time, embedded in Newtonian thought, in monastic bells, industrial schedules, and even personal routines, was no longer universally valid. Time became local. There was no cosmic timekeeper. The sense of a shared present faded into an observer-dependent mosaic. Each moving body carried its own clock. Shared schedules remained useful at human scales, but at speeds approaching light, or near intense gravity, time diverged. Our lived time and physics time parted ways. Einstein's revolution also reshaped our existential orientations. The absence of cosmic simultaneity complicated notions of global cosmic beginnings and endings. In relativistic cosmology, the Big Bang becomes a local time origin for each world line, but simultaneity across the universe is frame-dependent. The end of time, heat, death, cosmic collapse, or quantum events is no longer an absolute universal endpoint, but a conditional, observer-related concept. The Christian and Islamic eschatological frameworks, built on universal chronology, seemed inadequate on a cosmological scale, time's meaning fragmenting across observers and expanses. Yet, for human purposes, navigation, planning, social coordination, relativistic effects are negligible. Newtonian approximation works impeccably. Engineers in everyday life continue to use clocks and schedules intact, but deep down, physics had changed. Time was no longer an invisible stage. It was part of the performance. Space-time curvature, relativity of simultaneity, time dilation, they revealed that time was contextual, conditional, and variable, not constant. The intuitive sense of time as universal and uniform was revealed as a useful convenience, not metaphysical truth. In summarizing this revolution, one sees a transformation that is both scientific and existential. Time no longer flows uniformly everywhere. It dilates and contracts, bends and warps, seeming stable at human speeds, but revealing its malleability at cosmic and quantum scales. The Newtonian illusion gives way to a richer, more complex reality, the time of the cosmos from which emerges, the time of consciousness. As relativity reshapes physics, it also reshapes how we think about ourselves, as observers piecing together subjective nows from a universe that knows no shared now. With Einstein's relativity having shattered the classical, Newtonian concept of time as absolute and universal, the 20th century introduced yet another profound challenge to our understanding of time, this time arising not from the macroscopic world of stars and gravity, but from the bizarre and probabilistic domain of the quantum, where relativity had woven space and time into a flexible, curved fabric. Quantum mechanics forced physicists to confront time's nature at the smallest scales of matter and energy, where certainty dissolves into probability and the very act of measurement alters reality itself. At the heart of quantum mechanics lies the Schrödinger equation, formulated in the mid-1920s, which governs the evolution of a quantum system's wave functioner, mathematical object, encoding probabilities of finding particles in particular states. Unlike classical trajectories traced by planets or billiard balls, the wave function does not describe a definite position or velocity, but rather a superposition of possibilities. Time in this equation acts as an external parameter, flowing smoothly and continuously, much like Newtonian absolute time. The wave function evolves deterministically according to this time parameter until measurement occurs. Herein lies attention. Quantum mechanics predicts probabilities. But what happens when a measurement forces the wave function to collapse into a definite state? This collapse appears instantaneous, non-deterministic, and, crucially, outside the smooth flow governed by the Schrödinger equation. Time seems to behave differently depending on whether a system is isolated or observed. The continuous evolution is interrupted by sudden jumps events that defy a simple temporal narrative. The so-called measurement problem continues to vex physicists and philosophers alike. One key question emerges: is time in quantum mechanics fundamental, or merely a parameter reflecting classical backgrounds? Unlike general relativity, where time is dynamical and intertwined with space, the standard quantum formalism treats time as an independent, absolute parameter, external clock against which changes happen. This is unsatisfactory for many reasons, especially when attempting to unify quantum mechanics with gravity. After all, if space-time is itself quantum, How can time be classical and fixed? This clash points toward a more radical idea. At quantum scales, time itself may be emergent, not fundamental. Some formulations of quantum gravity attempts to unify quantum mechanics with general relativities, suggest that the familiar flow of time arises only as an approximate concept within a timeless quantum reality. The Wheeler-DeWitt equation, proposed in the 1960s, is one such example. It attempts to describe the quantum state of the entire universe, but contains no explicit time variable. This timeless equation poses a profound puzzle. How does the classical flow of time, with past, present, and future, emerge from a fundamentally atemporal framework? Quantum entanglement further complicates the picture. Entangled particles exhibit correlations instantaneously, no matter how far apart they are, seemingly defying classical notions of space and time. While no information travels faster than light, these spooky actions at a distance, as Einstein called them, suggests that the classical causal order of events is not fundamental. Instead, quantum states appear woven together in ways that transcend temporal sequencing. This challenges the traditional linear model of cause and effect, demanding a more subtle understanding of time's role. Decoherence provides part of the story. It explains how quantum systems, once isolated, interact with their environments, causing the superposition of states to decohere into classical mixtures. Decoherence offers a mechanism by which classical time and classical realities emerge from quantum probabilities. It bridges the gap between the timeless quantum micro-world and the temporal macro-world we experience. However, it does not fully resolve the measurement problem or explain why one particular outcome occurs when we observe. Moreover, quantum experiments involving delayed choice and quantum erasers reveal that the temporal order of cause and effect can be ambiguous. Measurements performed after a particle passes through a setup can influence outcomes retroactively in the sense of correlations, blurring our intuitive sense of a fixed timeline. This suggests that temporal order may be less fundamental than the structure of quantum correlations. Philosophers and physicists have developed various interpretations of quantum mechanics to grapple with these issues, each with different implications for time. The Copenhagen interpretation maintains a classical time parameter but treats wave function collapse as a fundamental process that disrupts smooth time evolution. The many worlds interpretation eliminates collapse, positing that all possibilities unfold in a vast multiverse, implying that time evolution is deterministic but our experience is limited to a single branch. Other approaches, such as the transactional interpretation, propose a handshake across time between past and future, suggesting retrocausal elements. These diverse views underscore how quantum mechanics unsettles our assumptions about temporal flow, causality, and the arrow of time. Unlike relativity, which preserved a temporal order even if relative, quantum mechanics opens the door to a more fragmented, probabilistic, and possibly non-linear conception of time. At the practical level, time in quantum theory governs processes like radioactive decay, tunneling, and the behavior of quantum computers. These phenomena are time-dependent but also probabilistic, and understanding their temporal behavior is crucial to technology and fundamental science. Attempts to reconcile quantum mechanics and general relativity continue to wrestle with times. Nature. Theories like loop quantum gravity and string theory suggest discrete or emergent spacetimes, where time may not be fundamental but an emergent property of deeper structures. Time might arise from entanglement patterns or informational flows rather than existing as a background parameter. This perspective invites us to reconsider what we mean by flow and passage of time. The smooth, continuous flow modeled by clocks and relativity may be an emergent phenomenon, arising from the interplay of quantum events and thermodynamic irreversibility. In this picture, time's passage is a macroscopic illusion born of microscopic quantum probabilities and environmental decohesion. Thus, the quantum revolution in our understanding of time challenges the very foundations laid by Newton and Einstein. It exposes time as a complex, layered concept, simultaneously a parameter in equations, a property emerging from quantum entanglement, and a psychological experience rooted in memory and expectation. Far from a simple tick of the clock, time at the quantum level is a dance of probabilities, collapses, and correlations that defy straightforward narrative. In the wake of this understanding, physics now grapples with how to describe time when space, matter, and energy lose their classical clarity. This ongoing quest shapes the frontier of science, philosophy, and even consciousness studies, revealing time not as a single phenomenon, but a nexus of intersecting layers that resist easy categorization. While quantum mechanics challenges our understanding of time at microscopic scales, another fundamental aspect of the universe grounds time's passage firmly in the macroscopic world, thermodynamics. Unlike the reversible, symmetric laws of classical and quantum physics, thermodynamics introduces an irreversible directionality to physical processes, giving time its unmistakable arrow. This arrow of time, anchored in entropy, shapes everything, from the cooling of a cup of coffee to the evolution of galaxies, and it has profound implications for physics, philosophy, and our experience of reality. The roots of this arrow lie in the second law of thermodynamics, formulated in the 19th century by scientists such as Rudolf Clausius and Lord Kelvin. The law states that, in an isolated system, the total entropy, a measure of disorder, or the number of microscopic configurations consistent with a macroscopic state, can never decrease. Put simply, systems evolve naturally from ordered states toward more disordered ones. Ice melts, gases diffuse, and energy spreads out. This law is statistical rather than absolute, but its near universality confers a direction to time that no mechanical law had provided. To appreciate the significance of entropy's role, consider a simple example: a gas confined to one side of a box. If the barrier separating the box is removed, the gas molecules spread evenly throughout. The entropy increases because there are far more ways for the gas to be spread out than for it to be compressed on one side. Crucially, the reverse spontaneously gathering back into one half is so unlikely that it is effectively impossible on any practical timescale. Here, entropy defines a preferred temporal direction, from low entropy, ordered, localized gas, to high entropy, disordered, dispersed gas. The physicist Ludwig Boltzmann was instrumental in connecting microscopic physics with macroscopic thermodynamics. His statistical mechanics framework showed how entropy arises from the probability distributions of particle configurations. Boltzmann's famous equation, S equals K log W, relates entropy, S, to the number of microstates, W corresponding to a macrostate, with K being Boltzmann's constant. This insight explained why the second law emerges naturally from statistical considerations, even though fundamental particle interactions are Yet, this statistical arrow posed a puzzle. If the underlying laws are time-symmetric, Why does the universe start in a state of such low entropy that entropy can increase at all? This is the so-called past hypothesis, the assumption that the early universe had extraordinarily low entropy. Without this initial condition, the arrow of time would not emerge. The question of why the universe began in this improbable, low-entropy state remains one of the deepest mysteries in physics and cosmology. Thermodynamics. Arrow of time also informs the heat-death hypothesis, first formulated in the 19th century by scientists like William Thomson, Lord Kelvin, and Hermann von Helmholtz. This hypothesis posits that the universe will eventually reach thermodynamic equilibrium maximum entropy where no energy gradients remain to perform work. In such a state, all processes cease, stars burn out, and the cosmos approaches a dark, cold, lifeless future. Time, in this scenario, continues but loses all directional meaning as change itself halts. Historically, the discovery of thermodynamics and entropy shook not only physics but also metaphysics and philosophy. Before the 19th century, time was often considered cyclical or reversible. Many ancient and classical philosophies, from Hindu cosmology to Stoicism, imagined eternal returns or rhythmic cycles. The steady increase of entropy suggested a temporal one-way street, a history with a beginning and an end. This linearization of time dovetailed with the rise of scientific cosmology and biblical cosmologies alike, both positing a unique origin. The universe was not eternal in a steady state, but had a beginning, a low-entropy initial state that set the arrow pointing forward. The heat death also suggested an eventual end. These ideas reshaped how humans understood temporality, fate, and cosmic destiny. In parallel, thermodynamics influenced philosophy deeply. Thinkers like Arthur Schopenhauer and later Henry Bergson grappled with the tension between mechanical determinism and the felt flow of time. Bergson, for example, emphasized the lived experience of duration la durée, contrasting it with mechanistic time, hinting at time's irreducibility to mere spatial measurement. Entropy seemed to bridge the gap between physics and phenomenology by giving a physical basis to irreversible experience at the same time. The arrow of time provided a physical grounding for the concept of memory and causality. Our ability to remember the past and not the future links directly to entropy's increase. Memories form from ordered structures in a sea of increasing disorder. Causes precede effects because the microscopic states that produce effects are statistically dependent on prior configurations, which are themselves constrained by low entropy initial conditions. The discovery of thermodynamics also raised deep questions about free will, determinism, and the nature of chance. If physical processes are driven by probabilistic tendencies rather than absolute necessity, does this open a space for indeterminacy and creativity? Or does the inexorable increase of entropy doom all systems to predictable decay? These debates continue in philosophy of science and metaphysics. In the 20th century, thermodynamics' arrow was linked with cosmology and quantum mechanics in new ways. The expansion of the universe affects entropy. Gravitational clumping forms stars and galaxies, creating local decreases in entropy offset by overall increases. The role of black holes in entropy, as revealed by Bekenstein and Hawking, ties thermodynamics to quantum gravity and information theory, suggesting that time, entropy, and information are deeply interwoven at fundamental levels. Moreover, recent work in statistical physics and complex systems explores how arrows of time emerge from information processing and thermodynamic constraints. Life itself, as a phenomenon that locally reduces entropy while increasing it globally, embodies the arrow of time in biological processes. The transition from physics to biology to consciousness reveals layers of temporal asymmetry, each building on thermodynamics. Despite its physical rigor, the arrow of time retains an elusive quality. Entropy explains why certain processes are irreversible and why time feels directional, yet it does not fully explain the subjective experience of time's flow. The feeling of now, the passage from future to present to past, remains partly a mystery, suggesting that thermodynamics provides the skeleton but not the flesh of temporal experience. This recognition connects with prior sections' reflections on quantum mechanics and relativity, where time's nature became more subtle and contingent, while relativity showed time's variability across observers. Thermodynamics grounds time's irreversibility in physical law, and quantum mechanics challenges the very continuity and definiteness of temporal evolution. Together, these insights reveal that time is multifaceted. It is a dimension warped by gravity and speed, a parameter in probabilistic equations, and a direction imposed by the growth of entropy. Our daily experience is shaped largely by this last aspect, the arrow of time through which we navigate memory, causality, and change. As modern physics continues to probe the earliest moments of the universe, the nature of black holes, and quantum gravity, the arrow of time remains central. Understanding how time emerges from fundamental laws, how entropy governs its direction, and how consciousness interfaces with temporal flow remains one of the grand challenges at the frontier of knowledge. While thermodynamics gave us the arrow of time, a physical directionality anchored in the increase of entropy, our lived experience of time feels more intimate, more fluid, and more mysterious. The sensation of now, the continuity of memory, and the anticipation of the future are not just byproducts of physical laws. They are woven deeply into the structures of consciousness. Exploring how the brain experiences time invites us into the intersecting worlds of psychology, neuroscience, and philosophy, revealing time as an internal construction shaped by perception and cognition. Our subjective sense of time begins with duration, the experience that moments flow and extend rather than merely existing as points on a clock. The American psychologist William James, often called the father of modern psychology, was among the first to explore this. In his seminal work, The Principles of Psychology, 1890, James introduced the concept of the specious present, the short duration of awareness within which our consciousness perceives continuity. Unlike a mathematical instant, the specious present lasts long enough to include the immediate past and anticipated near future, forming the foundation for the feeling of temporal flow. James's insights challenged earlier mechanistic views of time as discrete ticks. Instead, he saw consciousness as a continuous stream, with the present moment encompassing a brief interval now that extends beyond the immediate point in time. This idea hinted at time as a lived experience rather than a mere external measurement. For James, time was not simply an object of measurement but a dynamic quality of mind. Around the same period, French philosopher Henri Bergson also emphasized this qualitative aspect of time, coining the term duration to describe the lived flow of time. Bergson rejected the spatialization of time into discrete units, seconds, minutes, hours, and insisted that real time was continuous, indivisible, and experienced as a qualitative flow. According to Bergson, duration was an irreducible dimension of consciousness, distinct from the objective time of science. He argued that understanding time required engaging with lived experience rather than abstract measurement. Though influential, these early theories were primarily philosophical and introspective, limited by the absence of neurological data. The 20th century, however, witnessed breakthroughs in neuroscience and psychology that began to illuminate the biological basis of time perception. Researchers discovered that the brain does not rely on a single clock, but uses multiple neural mechanisms to process temporal information at different scales. One major finding was the role of the cerebellum and basal ganglia in millisecond to second timing, essential for motor coordination, speech, and perception of rhythmic patterns. Experiments using fMRI and electrophysiology showed that these brain regions activate during tasks requiring precise timing. In contrast, longer duration perception minutes to hours engages cortical areas, including the prefrontal cortex, where working memory and executive function reside. Memory itself, foundational for temporal experience, depends heavily on the hippocampus, a brain structure critical for encoding and retrieving episodic memories, the personal events tied to time and place. The hippocampus helps weave temporal sequences into narratives, enabling us to place experiences in an order and recall the past as a coherent story rather than a jumble of sensations. Damage to this area results in profound amnesia, erasing the sense of personal history and disrupting the continuity of time consciousness. Anticipation, the capacity to project ourselves into the future, is equally vital. Neuroimaging studies have revealed that many of the same brain networks engaged in memory retrieval also activate when imagining future scenarios. This overlap suggests that the brain constructs time-based mental simulations by recombining elements of past experiences to anticipate possible outcomes. This faculty underpins planning, decision-making, and even creativity, all rooted in the temporal architecture of cognition. Modern psychology has also identified various distortions in time perception under different conditions, illuminating its malleability. Emotional states can accelerate or decelerate the felt passage of time. Moments of fear or crisis may seem to slow down. Boredom can make minutes drag endlessly. Drugs, attention, and age also affect how time is experienced. These phenomena demonstrate that time, while measurable objectively, is profoundly subjective in its felt qualities. The now moment, which seems so immediate and present, also presents paradoxes. Neuroscientific studies show that what we perceive as now is actually a construction delayed by hundreds of milliseconds as sensory information is processed. Our brains integrate incoming stimuli over short intervals to create a coherent temporal snapshot. This means our awareness of the present is always slightly behind real-time events, yet seamlessly stitched together to feel instantaneous. Further complexity arises when considering temporal binding, the brain's ability to integrate sensory inputs separated by brief delays into a unified perceptual event. Experiments demonstrate that the brain compensates for these lags, synchronizing sights, sounds, and actions into a consistent temporal experience. Without such integration, our perception of the world would fragment, and time would feel disjointed. Historical thinkers also speculated on the relationship between time and consciousness. Immanuel Kant argued that time, along with space, was a form of intuition, a structure through which the mind organizes experience. He maintained that time is not an external property, but a necessary framework of human cognition. This insight parallels modern cognitive science's view that time perception is an active construction rather than passive reception. Phenomenologists like Edmund Husserl deepened this exploration, describing how consciousness unfolds temporally, with retention immediate past, primal impression now, and pretension immediate future forming the temporal structure of experience. Husserl's analyses resonate with neuroscientific findings on how brain networks encode sequences and anticipate events. Bridging philosophy and empirical science, this interplay between memory and anticipation shapes our sense of identity and agency. The continuity of self depends on memory linking past experiences with present awareness, while anticipation informs goals and motivation. Time consciousness allows us to act in the world with foresight and learn from history. Additionally, studies on disorders like schizophrenia and temporal lobe epilepsy reveal how disruptions in time perception and temporal binding can fragment consciousness, producing experiences of temporal dislocation or altered flow. These clinical insights underscore time's foundational role in the architecture of mind. The subjective experience of time also intersects with cultural and linguistic factors. Different cultures conceptualize and talk about time in varying cyclic versus linear, event-focused versus clock-focused, affecting how individuals perceive and interact with time. Language shapes temporal cognition, influencing how memory and anticipation are framed. Technological advances continue to deepen our understanding. Functional MRI, e.g., and even invasive single neuron recordings enable scientists to observe brain activity patterns associated with timing tasks and temporal judgments. Machine learning models now simulate aspects of time perception, shedding light on how neural networks encode duration and sequence. Ultimately, the neuroscience of time shows that while physical time ticks uniformly on clocks and within equations, psychological time is a rich, multifaceted phenomenon. It arises from complex interactions among brain regions, memory systems, attention mechanisms, and environmental cues. This inner temporality grounds the flow of experience, weaving together past, present, and future into a coherent narrative. Our conscious awareness of time, the sense of a now, the ability to remember, and the capacity to anticipate is what makes the external dimensions of physics meaningful in lived reality. Time, as a psychological phenomenon, shapes how we experience life, make decisions, and construct meaning. It bridges the abstract temporal structures described by science with the immediate, felt reality of existence. The intimate, richly textured experience of time within consciousness reveals that time is far from a simple, external phenomenon. Yet this raises profound questions that reach beyond neuroscience and physics. What if time itself is a kind of illusion, an emergent or constructed phenomenon, rather than a fundamental feature of reality? Could time, as we perceive it, be a simulation or projection, shaped by mental frameworks, technological mediation, or even the fundamental nature of existence? These speculative inquiries bridge philosophy, cognitive science, and cutting-edge metaphysics, challenging our assumptions about the reality of time. At the heart of this contemplation is the tension between time as a measurable dimension quantified by clocks, calendars, and digital counters and time as it appears in lived experience, dreams, and altered states of consciousness. Consider the relentless ticking of digital clocks, precise and uniform, endlessly subdividing time into binary pulses. This modern invention reduces time to discrete increments, a far cry from the continuous, flowing duration described by Bergson or the psychologically rich, specious present of William James. Digital time imposes a rigid, mechanized order on what was once an organic, and variable experience. Philosophers have long grappled with the idea that time might not be fundamentally real in the way physical objects are. Immanuel Kant argued that time, along with space, is a necessary a priori form of human intuition or structural lens, through which the mind organizes experience rather than an objective feature of things in themselves. For Kant, time did not exist independently outside human cognition. It was a framework shaping all phenomena. This view implies that time is inseparable from consciousness, a mental condition for perceiving change. Arthur Schopenhauer, influenced by Kant, took this further in his World as Will and Representation, proposing that time, space, and causality are forms of representation ways the world appears to us, shaped by our minds, while the underlying reality, the will, is timeless, and beyond such distinctions. For Schopenhauer, the flow of time is an aspect of phenomenal appearance, an illusion masking the eternal, changeless essence beneath. This perspective resonates with many Eastern philosophies that conceive of time as Maya, or illusion, an ephemeral veil over ultimate reality. In contemporary philosophy, these ideas have found new life, especially with the rise of simulation, hypotheses, and virtual reality studies. Philosopher Nick Bostrom famously proposed that advanced civilizations might create simulated realities indistinguishable from real ones. Within such simulations, the fabric of space and time might be artificial constructs codes and algorithms governing causality and duration. If we inhabit such a simulation, our experience of time could be programmed, discrete, and emergent rather than fundamental. This hypothesis, while speculative, invites us to reconsider our everyday trust in time's continuity and uniformity. Digital computers operate through discrete time steps, pulses in a processor's clock, suggesting that at some fundamental level, time might not be smooth, but quantized divisible only into minimal units, akin to Planck time in physics. If the universe itself is informational or computational, time may be a processing cycle rather than an independent dimension. The illusion of time, also, appears vividly in dreams and altered states of consciousness, where subjective time often distorts dramatically. In dreams, minutes can stretch into hours or entire lifetimes, or conversely, vast experiences can flash by in moments. Neuroscientific studies show that during REM sleep, brain activity patterns differ radically from waking states, suggesting that the internal construction of time diverges sharply from physical time. This dissociation implies that the brain's timekeeping is flexible and heavily dependent on cognitive and perceptual context. Similarly, psychedelic experiences and meditative states reveal distortions or suspensions of temporal flow. Users report timelessness, time loops, or a collapse of past, present, and future into an undifferentiated now. These phenomenological reports suggest that temporal experience is malleable and contingent on neural activity and consciousness state, not fixed by external clocks, virtual reality, and augmented reality technologies further complicate our relationship with time. Immersive digital environments can manipulate temporal perception by altering sensory input, pacing events differently, or creating environments where time flows at non-ordinary speeds. These technologies reveal how time is not just measured externally, but constructed internally through interaction between sensory information, cognition, and culture. The influence of cultural frameworks also shapes temporal illusions. Different societies conceptualize time variously as linear, cyclic, or event-based, influencing how individuals internalize and experience duration and sequence. Indigenous Cultures often perceive time as a web of interconnected events rather than a linear arrow, offering alternative modes of temporal awareness that challenge Western clock-bound conceptions. Philosophers like Henry Bergson anticipated these reflections, warning against confusing mathematical time with lived duration. He saw that quantifying time risks losing its essential quality as a continuous flow experienced uniquely by each consciousness. The digital clock's slicing of time into uniform increments is a practical necessity, but a simplification that obscures the complexity of temporal consciousness. On the scientific frontier, physicists exploring quantum gravity and the nature of space-time also encounter suggestions that time may not exist at the deepest levels. In loop quantum gravity, space-time emerges from discrete spin networks, potentially making time itself emergent and not fundamental. Julian Barber, a physicist and philosopher, has argued for a timeless physics where change is described without invoking a background time, instead arising from correlations between configurations. These ideas echo ancient philosophical doubts about the reality of time. Parmenides, an early Greek thinker, denied the reality of change and motion, implying that time might be illusory. Zeno's paradoxes similarly challenge the coherence of continuous time and motion, foreshadowing modern scientific puzzles. In the age of digital clocks, instantaneous communications, and virtual realities, the boundaries between real and simulated time blur. Our daily lives increasingly unfold, mediated by devices that track and regulate time with atomic precision, shaping rhythms of work, social life, and even biological cycles. This technological embedding of time raises questions about how human temporal experience adapts to, resists, or is shaped by mechanical precision. Ultimately, the speculation that time might be a simulation or construct unsettles deep metaphysical convictions. If time is not fundamental but emergent or illusory, what does this mean for causality, free will, and existence itself? If the flow of time is a feature of consciousness or a programmed illusion, then reality may be more fluid and mysterious than classical intuition allows. Yet even if time is a construct, it is one deeply ingrained in our experience, shaping our memories, plans, emotions, and actions. The challenge is to integrate scientific insights about relativity, quantum mechanics, and neuroscience with philosophical reflections on time's nature, embracing its multifaceted character as physical dimension, psychological experience, and possibly an illusion. As our understanding deepens, the line between time as measured by clocks and time as lived and imagined grows ever more nuanced. The interplay of physical processes, brain mechanisms, cultural practices, and metaphysical assumptions weaves a complex tapestry, inviting continued exploration of what time really is or what it might be beyond appearances. While modern science and philosophy often emphasize time as linear, a sequence of past, present, and future marked by irreversible progression, the idea of circular or cyclical time has a rich and enduring presence in many cultures and intellectual traditions. This cyclical conception of time, embedded deeply in mythology, religion, and cosmology, presents an alternative to the arrow of time's linear narrative. It envisions time as a recurring loop, an endless repetition of cycles, where beginnings and endings intertwine and existence itself oscillates between renewal and decay. In ancient Hindu cosmology, time is envisioned through vast cycles known as yugas, enormous epochs spanning millions of years. These cycles form a grand cosmic rhythm, where the universe undergoes repeated phases of creation, preservation, dissolution, and quiescence. The four, Yugasatya, Treta, Devapara, and Kali, represent successive ages, each characterized by differing degrees of virtue and decline. After the Kali Yuga, often associated with moral degeneration, the cycle returns to Satya Yuga, a golden age, thus initiating a new cosmic round. This cyclical model does not merely measure time but deeply informs moral and spiritual understanding. Life and history are not linear progressions but patterns of rise and fall, a perpetual dance of cosmic forces. Human lives, too, participate in this rhythm through the doctrine of reincarnation, samsara, the continuous cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. The soul journeys through numerous lifetimes, evolving spiritually until liberation, moksha, frees it from the cycle. Time here is inseparable from karma, cause and effect extended beyond a single lifespan, intertwining temporal cycles with ethical dimensions. Similarly, Buddhist philosophy embraces a cyclical view of existence, but often emphasizes the of all things. Samsara is the wheel of suffering, repeated births and deaths bound by craving and ignorance. The Buddhist path seeks to transcend this cycle through enlightenment, nirvana, escaping the recurring temporal pattern. The cyclic nature of time in Buddhism highlights the futility of clinging to transient phenomena and points to a timeless reality beyond cycles, beyond the Indian traditions. Other ancient cultures conceived time cyclically. The Mayans, for instance, developed intricate calendars that marked vast cycles, including the famous long count calendar, reflecting cosmological rhythms rather than a linear timeline. Their rituals and prophecies connected human affairs with celestial cycles, suggesting a cosmos that moves through repeating patterns in classical Western thought. While linear time became dominant, there remained strains of cyclical thinking. The Stoics, for example, envisioned the cosmos undergoing periodic conflagrations, ekpyrosis, followed by rebirth, a cosmic cycle that repeated eternally. Similarly, the ancient Greeks were aware of cyclical concepts of time, though these were often subordinate to the emerging linear historical consciousness. In modern philosophy, Friedrich Nietzsche revitalized the idea of cyclical time through his doctrine of the eternal return. Nietzsche provocatively posed the question: if one had to live their life repeatedly, in exactly the same sequence, infinitely many times, would one affirm such an existence? The eternal return is both a metaphysical hypothesis and an existential challenge, urging a radical embrace of life's totality. It reframes time not as a linear arrow carrying us toward an end, but as a circle where every moment recurs eternally. Nietzsche's eternal return serves as a counterpoint to the Christian linear eschatology dominant in Western culture. Instead of a definitive final judgment or apocalypse, time is an endless cycle, and meaning emerges through affirmation of repetition. This conception challenges the idea of progress or ultimate purpose located in a future end, proposing instead that meaning is found in the eternal recurrence of the present. The tension between circular and linear time paradigms has been a persistent theme in intellectual history. The rise of scientific cosmology and thermodynamics, with their implications of a universe with a beginning and eventual heat-death, seem to affirm linear, directional time. Yet, cycles remain pervasive in nature. The oscillations of seasons, lunar phases, biological rhythms, and ecological processes all reflect cyclical temporalities. Some modern cosmological models even entertain cyclic universes, where the cosmos undergoes a series of expansions and contractions, each Big Bang followed by a Big Crunch, potentially repeating indefinitely. These theories suggest a reconciliation of cyclic and linear time, with each cycle possessing a beginning and an end, but embedded in a broader eternal recurrence. Mythologies worldwide embed cyclical time deeply into cultural consciousness. The ancient Egyptian belief in the daily rebirth of the sun god Ra across the sky is a metaphor for renewal and regeneration. Similarly, indigenous Australian dreamtime narratives evoke timeless ancestral beings whose stories unfold in cycles. Beyond linear chronology, blending past, present, and future into a timeless continuum, in the psychological realm, the experience of cyclical time can manifest through seasonal affective disorders or mood cycles, reflecting embodied rhythms. The human body itself is governed by circadian rhythms, biological cycles, aligned with the day-night rotation, demonstrating how cyclical time is fundamental to life processes. Even within the linear, clock-driven societies, festivals and rituals often mark cyclical celebrations of seasonal change, linking communal life to natural temporalities. These practices maintain an ancestral memory of cyclicity beneath the dominant linear time. Philosophically, reconciling cyclical and linear time remains challenging. Linear time underpins causality, historical change, and personal narratives, progressing toward futures. Circular time emphasizes repetition, return, and eternal patterns. Yet, some thinkers argue these are complementary rather than contradictory perspectives, highlighting different dimensions of temporal reality. For example, a human life may be experienced linearly, with birth and death framing a narrative arc, yet embedded within cultural and natural cycle seasons, years, generations that repeat endlessly. Time may be both arrow and wheel, flowing forward while turning in circles. The synthesis of cyclical and linear time invites a richer understanding of temporality, one that honors both the irreversible passage of events and the enduring rhythms that sustain life and meaning. Such integration appears in modern ecological thinking, which views human history within planetary cycles, and in contemporary spirituality, which blends linear progress with cyclical renewal. Ultimately, circular conceptions of time challenge the primacy of linear chronology and invite reflection on the deeper patterns governing existence. They suggest that endings are beginnings, that destruction is regeneration, and that time may fold back on itself in ways that defy simple narrative. This ancient yet persistently compelling vision expands our temporal imagination beyond clocks and calendars, beckoning us to see time not merely as a line, but as a vast, repeating dance where every moment participates in eternal return. The recurring cycles of time, whether through ancient cosmologies or Nietzsche's eternal return, paint a picture of time as an endless dance, a cosmic rhythm without a final end. Yet, modern physics and cosmology confront us with a strikingly different and unsettling possibility: that time itself might have a finite lifespan, that it might be an emergent or even illusory phenomenon destined to cease or vanish under certain conditions. This notion raises profound questions about the very fabric of reality and the ultimate fate of the universe. Classical thermodynamics introduced the idea of the heat death of the universe, a state in which all energy gradients vanish. Entropy reaches its maximum, and no work can be performed. In this bleak scenario, time loses its meaning because change ceases. The universe becomes a static, uniform expanse. But the heat-death hypothesis is only one piece of a much larger puzzle about time's fundamental nature. Physicists investigating the quantum realm have found that time does not behave as a continuous and universal backdrop. Instead, it appears to lose its conventional role, giving way to more fundamental structures where time as we know it may dissolve entirely. This realization stems from the challenge of reconciling general relativity, which treats time as a dynamic dimension woven into the fabric of space-time, with quantum mechanics, where standard time parameters struggle to find footing. One of the most influential contemporary approaches to quantum gravity is loop quantum gravity, LQG, developed by Carlo Rovelli and others. In LQG, space-time itself is quantized, composed of discrete, network-like structures called spin networks that form the atoms of space. Here, the smooth continuum of time breaks down into fundamental units, hinting that time might be emergent rather than fundamental. Rovelli's work leads to a radical reconsideration of temporal notions. If space and time arise from these microscopic quantum geometries, then, at the deepest level, time as a continuous parameter does not exist. Instead, the universe's dynamics might be described by relations among quantum states without reference to an external clock. Time, in this view, is relational measure of change among systems rather than an absolute flow. This relational perspective resonates with the famous Wheeler-DeWitt equation in quantum cosmology, which effectively removes time from the fundamental description of the universe. The equation describes the quantum state of the entire cosmos in a timeless wave function, challenging the assumption that time is a fundamental variable. Philosopher and physicist Julian Barber has been a pioneering voice advocating for a timeless physics. Barber argues that time is a human abstraction, a convenient parameter extracted from the ordering of change rather than an independent dimension. His work suggests that reality consists of now's configurations of the universe without an underlying temporal flow. The sensation of time passing emerges from the sequence of these static snapshots, akin to frames in a film reel. This perspective shakes the foundations of how we conceive existence. If time is not fundamental but an emergent phenomenon dependent on change or observation, then the passage of time, the arrow we experience, is a secondary quality. The universe at its core may be timeless, and temporal flow an artifact of consciousness or macroscopic approximation. The implications of timeless physics extend to cosmology's grand questions. If time itself is emergent and contingent, what does this mean for the universe's origin and end? Standard Big Bang cosmology treats time as beginning with the singularity, time and space emerging together. But if time is not fundamental, the singularity might be a boundary of our classical description, beyond which traditional notions of before and after lose meaning. Moreover, modern cosmological models, considering quantum gravity effects, propose scenarios where time's flow alters near black holes or the universe's earliest moments. The Planck epoch, an ultra-early phase of the universe, might operate under physics where conventional time dissolves. In these regimes, space-time may foam, fluctuating in ways that defy linear temporal order. As we look forward, the ultimate fate of time ties closely to the fate of the universe itself. If the heat-death scenario is correct, time will approach a state where change is impossible, rendering time meaningless. Alternatively, some theories speculate about cyclic cosmologies, with time restarting in new Big Bangs, potentially regenerating temporal flow. Another possibility involves the multiverse, or eternal inflation, where different pocket universes have distinct temporal frameworks. In such a landscape, time may be local and context-dependent, varying across realms beyond our observable cosmos. Philosophically, these scientific developments echo ancient intuitions that time is not absolute. The loss or transformation of time at fundamental levels invites reflection on the nature of reality, existence, and consciousness. If time is not fundamental, what remains? Perhaps timeless being or an underlying unity transcending temporal distinctions. The confluence of physics, metaphysics, and cosmology thus points to a complex picture. Time is at once deeply embedded in our lived experience and scientific models, yet elusive at the fundamental level. It may be an emergent property arising from relations among physical systems, a construct shaped by consciousness, or a phenomenon that fades in extreme cosmic conditions. This realization invites a new humility about human understanding of time. While clocks and equations give us tools to measure and manipulate temporal intervals, the ultimate nature and fate of time remain open questions. The boundary between time and timelessness, between flow and stasis, challenges the limits of both. Physics and philosophy, in the end, contemplating the end of time itself, expands our temporal imagination. It pushes us to embrace mystery and wonder, recognizing that time may be a transient feature of the cosmos, a magnificent, fragile dance, destined to cease or transform beyond our current comprehension. As we navigate this frontier, the quest to understand time joins the deepest inquiries into existence, urging us to explore not only the universe's outer reaches, but the inner realms of consciousness and reality. The story of time is unfinished, a vast narrative stretching from the ancient cycles of yore to the cutting edges of timeless physics and beyond. Throughout this journey into the nature of time, we have encountered a landscape rich with paradox and complexity, a terrain where science, philosophy, culture, and consciousness intertwine. From the earliest celestial rhythms that marked human existence, to the abstract formalism of Newtonian absolutes, from Einstein's relativistic insights to the quantum puzzles of timelessness, time has proven elusive to define or capture fully. The question that opened this exploration, is time even real, or just a human illusion, resists simple answers, compelling us to hold competing visions in tension. Physically, time emerges as a dimension integral to the universe's structure, measurable by clocks and encoded in equations. The standard model of physics treats time as woven into space-time, shaping causality and motion. Yet, this physical time is far from the absolute and universal flow once assumed. Relativity revealed it to be relative, flexible, intertwined with space, and influenced by gravity and velocity. Quantum physics challenges this further, showing that time may lose meaning at fundamental levels, becoming emergent or even non-existent in certain frameworks. Simultaneously, psychological and philosophical perspectives remind us that time is deeply embedded in human consciousness and social practice. The lived experience of time, the flow of moments, the immediacy of the now, the weave of memory and anticipation is a mental construction shaped by brain mechanisms and cultural frameworks. The illusion of a continuous, objective present is maintained by neural processes that integrate sensory input and encode sequences. Dreams, altered states, and cultural variations underscore time's pliability and contingency. Moreover, time functions as a social tool, an organizing principle for human activity. Mechanical clocks and digital timers regiment labor, commerce, and communication, transforming time into a resource to be managed, bought, and sold. This commodification of time shapes modern life's rhythms and pressures, forging a temporal regime that governs experience and social relations. Historically, these layers of time have shifted in prominence and meaning. Ancient civilizations linked time to celestial cycles and sacred rituals, blending natural rhythms with mythic significance. Greek philosophers differentiated quantitative time from qualitative experience. Abrahamic traditions linearized time into narratives of creation and apocalypse, embedding it within theological frameworks. The scientific revolution and industrialization introduced mechanical, absolute, and then relativistic conceptions, pushing time toward precision and abstraction. In contemporary thought, quantum mechanics and cognitive science blur the boundaries between time as physical reality and as mental phenomenon. Philosophically, the question of time's reality probes fundamental metaphysical issues. Is time an independent entity existing out there, or a conceptual framework imposed by minds? Is the flow of time an objective feature or a subjective impression? Can time be reduced to relations among events, or is it a fundamental backdrop to existence? These debates reveal time as a deeply puzzling and layered concept that may defy final resolution, yet, regardless of its ontological status, belief in time's reality or its illusory nature profoundly shapes how we live, think, and hope. Time structures our narratives, anchoring identity through memory and projection. The idea of time's passage instills urgency, opportunity, loss, and anticipation. The belief in linear progression fuels hope and change, while cyclical time invites acceptance, renewal, and eternal return. If time is real in a physical sense, then our lives unfold within a universe governed by temporal laws, constrained by beginnings and endings. If time is a human construction, then our experience is a creative act, a weaving of moments into meaning. If time is both, we inhabit a complex interplay between external reality and internal consciousness, where illusion and fact intertwine. This dialectic invites a meditation on existence itself. Perhaps time is less a fixed entity than a living process, dynamic, emergent, and participatory. Like the dance of celestial bodies, the flicker of neurons, and the march of civilizations, time may be a thread woven through many layers of reality, visible and invisible, objective and subjective. In embracing the mystery of time, we acknowledge both our limits and our powers as temporal beings. We confront the paradox that while time may slip through definitive grasp, it is also the medium in which life unfolds, where meaning arises, where change occurs, and where we find ourselves moment by moment. Ultimately, whether time is real or illusory may matter less than how this understanding shapes our relationship to the present. Does seeing time as an illusion free us to live more fully, unbound by fear of loss or future anxieties? Or does it deepen appreciation for the fleeting now, the preciousness of duration? Perhaps the true question is not what time is, but how we choose to engage with it. As the sun rises and sets, as the cosmos expands and ages, as our thoughts drift between memory and anticipation, time remains a profound mystery. It is at once the measure of the universe and the heartbeat of experience, a paradox that invites wonder and reflection. In this ongoing dialogue between science and philosophy, physics and mind, history and culture, time stands as a symbol of human curiosity and the quest for meaning. The question, is time even real? opens a window onto our deepest inquiries about reality, consciousness, and our place in the cosmos. And as we peer through that window, the dance of time continues, endlessly unfolding, inviting us to witness, to question, and to live.